The radio crackled with the frantic voice of the lead F-16 pilot. "Command, this is Eagle 1. We have visual on the downed A-10. But there's something wrong with the tail number. It reads 810967. The silence that followed lasted exactly 7 seconds before command responded with disbelief. "Eagle 1, confirm that tail number. 810967 was lost over Syria 5 years ago." Pilot declared Kia. Through his cockpit canopy, Major Jake Collins stared at the battered A-10 Warthog sitting on the desert floor, smoke rising from one engine, but the aircraft intact enough that someone could still be alive inside. The tail number was clear, unmistakable, impossible, because 810967 belonged to Captain Victoria Phoenix Steele, the legendary pilot whose death had made headlines across every military newspaper in America. The woman whose memorial service had been attended by generals, whose name was engraved on a wall of heroes at Nellis Air Force Base, whose A-10 had been shot down over enemy territory with no chance of survival. But if the pilot inside that aircraft was dead, who had been flying combat missions against enemy positions for the past 5 years. Welcome to those who left a trace. Before we dive into this incredible story of survival, redemption, and the pilot who refused to come home until the mission was complete, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe that some warriors never stop fighting, even when the world thinks they're gone forever, hit that subscribe button. These stories remind us that legends don't die. They adapt, survive, and keep flying until their work is finished. The mission that had killed Captain Victoria Steele began on a Tuesday morning in March 2019, when intelligence reports indicated that ISIS leadership was conducting a high-value meeting in a compound 30 miles south of Raqqa, Syria. The target was designated as time-sensitive, requiring immediate air support before the terrorist commanders could disperse to safe houses across the region where they would be impossible to locate and eliminate. Victoria Phoenix Steele had been selected for the mission because her reputation for precision strikes in urban environments had made her one of the most requested close air support pilots in theater. In 18 months of deployment, she had conducted over 200 combat missions without a single incident of collateral damage, earning the kind of respect from ground forces that was usually reserved for pilots with decades of experience. Her A-10 Thunderbolt II, tail number 810967, was configured with a full combat load, 1,174 rounds of 30mm depleted uranium ammunition for the aircraft's legendary Ju-8 cannon, plus Maverick missiles and precision-guided bombs that would allow her to eliminate the target with surgical accuracy while minimizing risk to civilian populations in the surrounding area. The mission briefing had been routine. Intelligence indicated minimal air defense threats in the target area, with Syrian government forces focused on operations against rebel positions 50 miles to the west. Weather conditions were optimal for precision strikes, with clear skies and minimal wind that would allow accurate delivery of ordnance from altitudes that put the A-10 outside the range of most ground-based weapons. But intelligence assessments had failed to account for the presence of advanced surface-to-air missile systems that ISIS had acquired through black market arms dealers who specialized in providing sophisticated weapons to terrorist organizations with sufficient financial resources. The missiles were Russian-made SA-22 Greyhound systems that had been modified for mobility and concealment, allowing them to be positioned in areas where conventional intelligence gathering couldn't detect their presence. Victoria's approach to the target area proceeded normally until 0847 hours, when her aircraft's radar warning receivers detected the distinctive electronic signature of SA-22 missile guidance systems that were tracking her aircraft and preparing to engage. The warning came too late for evasive maneuvers that could have avoided missile engagement, but early enough for Victoria to execute defensive procedures that might allow her to survive the attack. The first missile struck Victoria's A-10 in the left engine, causing catastrophic damage that eliminated 50% of her aircraft's thrust while creating vibrations that made precision flying extremely difficult. The second missile detonated close enough to the aircraft to cause additional damage to flight control systems and communication equipment, but not close enough to destroy the aircraft outright. Victoria's training had prepared her for exactly this scenario. Single-engine operation in hostile territory with degraded systems and the need to either reach friendly territory or conduct emergency landing procedures that might allow survival and potential rescue. But the damage to her aircraft was more extensive than standard emergency procedures had been designed to handle, requiring improvised solutions that tested her flying skills and her understanding of A-10 systems beyond anything covered in normal training programs. Her radio communication with rescue coordination centers had been severed by missile damage, preventing her from transmitting her location or condition to forces that could provide assistance. Her navigation systems were functioning but degraded, providing general directional information but not the precise positioning data that would be necessary for accurate navigation to friendly airfields or designated emergency landing sites. Most critically, her fuel consumption had increased dramatically due to engine damage and the need to maintain higher power settings to compensate for reduced thrust. Calculations based on remaining fuel and estimated consumption rates indicated that she had perhaps 20 minutes of flight time before fuel exhaustion would force emergency landing procedures in territory that was certainly hostile and probably heavily defended. Victoria made a decision that would define the next 5 years of her life. Instead of attempting to reach friendly territory, where rescue was possible but fuel exhaustion was probable, she would conduct controlled emergency landing in enemy territory, where survival was uncertain, but where she might be able to evade capture long enough for rescue forces to locate and extract her. The landing site she selected was a dry riverbed approximately 15 miles north of her original target, far enough from ISIS positions to avoid immediate detection, but close enough to Syrian government forces that rescue operations might be feasible if she could survive long enough for search and rescue teams to locate her aircraft. Victoria's emergency landing was executed with a precision that had made her reputation as one of the Air Force's most skilled A-10 pilots. Despite significant damage to flight control systems and the loss of half her engine power, she managed to set the aircraft down in the riverbed without additional damage that would have made survival impossible. But successful emergency landing was only the beginning of challenges that would test every aspect of her survival training and her determination to continue the mission that had brought her to Syria in the first place. The first 48 hours after Victoria's emergency landing established patterns that would define her survival for the next 5 years. Her aircraft had come down in territory that was nominally controlled by Syrian government forces, but which was actually contested by multiple factions whose allegiances shifted based on tactical convenience rather than ideological commitment. Victoria's immediate priorities were survival-related, establishing a defensive position that could be concealed from aerial observation while providing protection from ground forces that might discover her location, securing water and food supplies that could sustain her until rescue operations could be attempted, and maintaining her aircraft and equipment in condition that would allow continued operations if rescue proved impossible. The A-10's design had anticipated exactly this scenario. The aircraft systems were configured to allow continued operation even after significant combat damage, and its weapon systems could be maintained and operated by a single pilot using procedures that had been developed specifically for survival situations in hostile territory. Victoria's survival training had included extensive instruction in evasion techniques, concealment methods, and the use of available resources for extended operations in enemy territory. But her situation was complicated by factors that exceeded normal survival scenarios. Her aircraft was too large to conceal completely. Her location was in an area where multiple hostile forces conducted regular patrols, and rescue operations would be extremely difficult due to the concentration of enemy air defense systems that had already demonstrated their effectiveness by shooting down her aircraft. After 72 hours without radio contact or rescue attempts, Victoria made a decision that transformed her from a downed pilot awaiting rescue into an active combatant conducting independent operations behind enemy lines. Using her aircraft's remaining weapon systems and her knowledge of enemy positions in the area, she would continue the mission that had brought her to Syria, eliminating ISIS leadership and disrupting terrorist operations that threatened civilian populations and allied forces. The decision was supported by tactical realities that made passive survival untenable as a long-term strategy. Enemy forces were conducting systematic searches for her aircraft, and discovery was inevitable unless she could eliminate or discourage the search efforts through direct action. More importantly, her position provided observation of enemy activities that could be disrupted through precision strikes that would achieve mission objectives, while drawing enemy attention away from search operations. Victoria's first independent combat mission occurred on the fourth day after her emergency landing, when she observed an ISIS convoy moving weapons and personnel through the valley where her aircraft had come down. Using her A-10's Gu-8 cannon, she conducted a precision strike that destroyed 3 vehicles and eliminated an estimated 15 enemy combatants while avoiding damage to civilian structures in the nearby village. The attack was precisely executed and tactically successful, but also announced Victoria's presence to enemy forces throughout the region and initiated a manhunt that would continue for the next 5 years. ISIS leadership understood that an American aircraft operating independently behind their lines represented both an immediate threat to their operations and a propaganda opportunity that could enhance their international reputation if they could capture or kill the pilot responsible. But Victoria's attack had also demonstrated something that neither ISIS nor coalition military planners had anticipated. A single A-10 aircraft, properly positioned and skillfully operated, could disrupt enemy operations across a wide area through selective strikes that were impossible to predict or prevent using conventional defensive measures. Victoria's aircraft had become what military strategists call a strategic asset, a resource whose presence affected enemy decision-making and operational planning far beyond its actual capabilities. ISIS forces throughout the region were forced to modify their movement patterns, reduce their operational tempo, and divert resources to searching for and eliminating a threat that could strike without warning and disappear before retaliation was possible. Over the following months, Victoria developed tactics that maximized her advantages while minimizing her exposure to enemy countermeasures. She used her detailed knowledge of the terrain to establish multiple concealed positions where her aircraft could be hidden during daylight hours, moving only at night, using routes that avoided enemy observation, while providing access to targets that could be engaged with maximum tactical impact. Her target selection focused on high-value assets that would disrupt enemy operations while creating the impression that coalition forces were conducting extensive special operations in areas where ISIS had previously felt secure. Ammunition depots, fuel storage facilities, communication centers, and leadership compounds became priority targets for precision strikes that were timed to maximize psychological impact while minimizing the resources required for each mission. But Victoria's most significant contribution to coalition operations was intelligence gathering that couldn't be obtained through satellite surveillance or conventional reconnaissance. Her position behind enemy lines provided direct observation of ISIS activities, logistics operations, and leadership movements that revealed patterns and vulnerabilities that were invisible to forces operating from established bases hundreds of miles away. The intelligence Victoria gathered was transmitted through improvised communication methods that used her aircraft systems in ways that hadn't been anticipated by equipment designers, but which proved effective for maintaining contact with coalition forces despite the loss of standard radio communication capabilities 0.6 months after Victoria's emergency landing. Coalition intelligence analysts began to notice patterns in enemy activities that suggested the presence of special operations. Forces conducting systematic sabotage and reconnaissance missions behind ISIS lines. Reports of precision strikes against high-value targets, combined with detailed intelligence about enemy movements and capabilities, indicated that coalition forces had established capabilities in areas where no official operations were being conducted. The reports were puzzling because they described activities that exceeded what small special operations teams could accomplish with available resources. While the precision and timing of the attacks suggested intimate knowledge of enemy operations that would require extensive reconnaissance and preparation time that special operations teams couldn't devote to individual targets. Air Force intelligence specialists eventually identified similarities between the reported attacks and the capabilities of A-10 aircraft, but the analysis was complicated by the fact that no A-10 operations were being conducted in the area where the attacks were occurring. The closest A-10 operations were being flown from bases over 300 miles away, which made regular missions to the reported target areas logistically impossible. The possibility that the attacks were being conducted by Captain Victoria Steele were considered and dismissed by intelligence analysts who reviewed the evidence. Victoria had been declared killed in action after search and rescue operations failed to locate any trace of her aircraft or evidence of survival following the missile attack that had been observed by coalition surveillance assets. But Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chun, an intelligence analyst who had worked closely with Victoria during mission planning for previous operations, recognized tactical patterns in the attacks that matched Victoria's approach to target selection and engagement procedures. The precision of the strikes, the timing of the operations, and the intelligence gathering methods being employed were consistent with Victoria's established operational patterns and her documented expertise in close air support missions. Colonel Chen's analysis suggested that Victoria had not only survived a missile attack and emergency landing, but had continued mission operations using her damaged aircraft as a base for independent combat operations behind enemy lines. The assessment was considered highly speculative by senior intelligence officials, but provided the only explanation for attack patterns that couldn't be attributed to any known coalition operations. The debate over Victoria's possible survival was resolved when coalition signals intelligence intercepted ISIS communications that specifically referenced the American female pilot, who was conducting strikes against their positions and who had become a priority target for elimination efforts that were diverting significant resources from other operational priorities. The intercepted communications provided confirmation that Victoria was not only alive, but actively engaged in combat operations that were significantly affecting ISIS capabilities and morale throughout the region. The communications also revealed that ISIS had identified her approximate operating area and was conducting systematic operations designed to locate and eliminate her before she could continue her attacks against their forces. The intelligence prompted immediate planning for search and rescue operations that would attempt to locate Victoria and extract her before ISIS forces could achieve their objective of eliminating the pilot, who had become one of their most serious tactical problems in the region. But search and rescue planning was complicated by the realization that Victoria had been conducting independent operations for 6 months without coalition support, and that her rescue would require operations in an area where she had established herself as a persistent threat to enemy forces, who would be prepared to defend against rescue attempts with whatever resources were necessary to prevent her extraction. Colonel Chen advocated for immediate rescue operations that would prioritize Victoria's extraction over other operational considerations, arguing that her intelligence value and her symbolic importance to coalition forces justified accepting higher risks than would normally be acceptable for rescue operations. But mission planners argued that rescue operations would require resources that were needed for other priority missions, and that the risks of conducting search and rescue in heavily defended enemy territory couldn't be justified when Victoria's survival was still uncertain and when rescue attempts might result in additional casualties without achieving successful extraction. The debate continued for 3 weeks while ISIS forces intensified their search efforts and Victoria continued conducting combat operations that provided valuable intelligence while making her location increasingly difficult to conceal from enemy forces that were devoting significant resources to finding and eliminating her. The decision to conduct rescue operations was finally made when intercepted communications revealed that ISIS forces had identified Victoria's general operating area and were planning a coordinated assault that would likely result in her capture or death within days of the planned operation. The rescue mission, designated Operation Phoenix Rising, was planned as a joint operation involving Air Force Special Operations aircraft, Army Special Forces personnel, and close air support assets that would provide covering fire during extraction procedures. The mission was scheduled to begin at 0400 hours on a Tuesday morning, when intelligence indicated that ISIS forces would be conducting shift changes that might provide opportunities for coalition forces to infiltrate the target area without immediate detection. But planning for Operation Phoenix Rising was disrupted when Victoria initiated radio contact with coalition forces for the first time since her emergency landing 6 months earlier. Her communication came through emergency frequencies that had been monitored continuously since her aircraft had been reported missing, and her message provided information that dramatically changed the scope and objectives of the planned rescue operation. Any coalition station. This is Phoenix Actual. Victoria's voice was clear despite significant static that indicated transmission through improvised communication equipment. I am operational and continuing mission. Request coordination for target packages that require precision close air support. Do not attempt rescue operations that could compromise ongoing mission effectiveness. The message lasted 47 seconds and provided location data, operational status, and mission requirements that revealed the extent of Victoria's activities during her 6 months of independent operations behind enemy lines. She had not been hiding and waiting for rescue. She had been conducting systematic combat operations that had significantly degraded ISIS capabilities, while gathering intelligence that would be valuable for coalition planning. Coalition commanders faced a decision that had no precedent in modern military operations: whether to continue with planned rescue operations for a pilot who was requesting mission support rather than extraction, or to provide the coordination and resources she needed to continue independent operations that were achieving strategic objectives at minimal cost to coalition resources. The debate was resolved by Victoria's second communication, transmitted 12 hours after her initial message. Coalition Command, this is Phoenix Actual. I have identified high-value target requiring immediate engagement. Request confirmation that precision strike is authorized against ISIS leadership compound at grid coordinates 36 degrees 9 minutes 47 seconds north, 38 degrees 31 minutes 22 seconds east. Time-sensitive target. Recommend engagement within next 6 hours before enemy relocation. The coordinates Victoria provided identified a compound that coalition intelligence had been attempting to locate for 8 months, the suspected command headquarters for ISIS operations throughout northern Syria. Intelligence sources had indicated that the compound contained leadership personnel whose elimination would significantly disrupt terrorist operations, but previous attempt to locate and confirm the target had been unsuccessful. Victoria's position behind enemy lines had allowed her to observe and confirm the compound's use by ISIS leadership through direct surveillance that satellite reconnaissance couldn't duplicate. Her request for authorization to engage the target represented an opportunity to eliminate high-value targets that might not be available through other operational methods. Coalition commanders authorized Victoria's strike against the ISIS leadership compound, marking the first time in modern military history that an independent combat operation by a single aircraft had been officially sanctioned for strategic target engagement. The authorization was provided with the understanding that Victoria's operations were achieving objectives that exceeded what could be accomplished through conventional coalition operations. Victoria's attack on the ISIS leadership compound was conducted at 2,147 hours using precision-guided munitions that eliminated the target while avoiding damage to civilian structures in the surrounding area. Post-strike assessment confirmed the elimination of 3 high-value targets whose deaths significantly disrupted ISIS command and control capabilities throughout the region. The success of Victoria's operation prompted revision of coalition strategy that incorporated her independent operations as an official component of broader military objectives in the region. Instead of attempting to rescue a downed pilot, coalition forces will provide logistical support and coordination for ongoing combat operations by a strategic asset whose unique position and capabilities were achieving results that couldn't be duplicated through conventional methods. The decision to support Victoria's independent operations rather than attempting her extraction was controversial within coalition command structures, but it was justified by operational results that demonstrated the effectiveness of her approach to combat operations in an environment where conventional tactics had achieved limited success. Victoria's transformation from downed pilot to independent strategic asset represented an evolution in military thinking about the use of individual capabilities in scenarios where conventional force structures were inadequate for achieving strategic objectives. Her operations demonstrated that properly trained and equipped individuals could achieve strategic effects in situations where larger forces would be ineffective or unavailable. Over the next 4 years, Captain Victoria Phoenix Steele became one of the most effective coalition assets operating against ISIS forces in Syria and Iraq. Her independent operations behind enemy lines evolved into a systematic campaign that eliminated dozens of high-value targets while providing intelligence that enabled coalition forces to disrupt terrorist operations across a wide area. Victoria's aircraft, initially damaged by missile attack and sustained through improvised maintenance procedures, was gradually upgraded and maintained through clandestine resupply operations that provided ammunition, fuel, and replacement parts through methods that avoided detection by enemy forces who continued to search for her location. The resupply operations were conducted by special operations teams that established cash supply points in areas where Victoria could access them without exposing her main operating locations to enemy observation. The operations were planned and executed with the same care given to strategic reconnaissance missions, reflecting the high value that coalition commanders placed on Victoria's continued operations. Victoria's tactical approach evolved to incorporate lessons learned from 4 years of combat operations in an environment where a single mistake could result in capture or death. She developed techniques for rapid displacement that allowed her to strike targets and relocate before enemy forces could respond effectively, while her target selection became increasingly sophisticated as her understanding of enemy operations improved through extended observation and engagement. Her most significant achievement was the systematic dismantling of ISIS leadership structure in northern Syria through precision elimination of key personnel who were responsible for coordinating terrorist operations throughout the region. Victoria's ability to observe enemy activities and strike targets at times when maximum leadership impact could be achieved made her operations far more effective than conventional airstrikes that relied on intelligence that was often outdated by the time missions could be executed. But Victoria's operations also extracted a personal cost that grew more severe with each year of independent deployment. Extended isolation behind enemy lines, combined with a constant threat of discovery and elimination, created psychological stress that exceeded what was experienced by pilots operating from established bases with regular rotation and support systems. Victoria's communication with coalition forces became increasingly focused on mission requirements rather than personal considerations, and her request for extraction or reassignment decreased to the point where coalition commanders began to question whether she was psychologically capable of resuming normal military operations if extraction became necessary. The question of Victoria's psychological condition was addressed through secure communication sessions with military psychologists who attempted to assess her mental health through conversations that were conducted under operational conditions that made conventional psychological evaluation impossible. The assessments concluded that Victoria remained mission-capable and psychologically stable, but that her extended isolation had produced adaptations that might make reintegration with conventional military operations difficult if she was eventually extracted from her independent operating environment. The assessments also concluded that Victoria's operations were providing strategic benefits that justified continued support for her independent missions, and that her psychological adaptations were appropriate responses to operational conditions rather than indicators of mental health deterioration that would require immediate intervention. Coalition commanders face an ethical dilemma that had no precedent in modern military operations: whether continue supporting the independent operations of a pilot whose effectiveness was unquestionable but whose psychological adaptation to extended isolation behind enemy lines might be irreversible. The dilemma was resolved by Victoria herself, who transmitted a message that provided her assessment of her condition and her intentions for future operations. Coalition Command, this is Phoenix Actual. I understand concerns about my psychological status and reintegration capabilities. I am mission capable and request continued authorization for independent operations. My effectiveness in this environment exceeds what I could contribute through conventional deployment. I volunteer for extended operations until strategic objectives are achieved. Victoria's volunteer status for extended independent operations was accepted by coalition commanders who understood that her unique capabilities and position were achieving strategic effects that couldn't be duplicated through other operational methods. Her operations would continue with full coalition support until ISIS leadership structure in the region was eliminated or until her position became untenable due to enemy countermeasures. The decision to accept Victoria's volunteer status for indefinite independent operations was classified at levels that prevented public discussion of her activities, but her operations became legendary within military communities that understood the strategic impact of her 4-year campaign behind enemy lines. The incident that would finally bring Victoria home began on a Thursday morning in October 2024, when ISIS forces launched their most determined effort to locate and eliminate the pilot who had become their primary tactical concern in northern Syria. The operation involved over 200 enemy combatants, sophisticated detection equipment, and coordination with Syrian government forces who had been convinced that eliminating Victoria was essential for regional stability. The enemy operation was more extensive and better coordinated than previous search efforts, using detection methods and search patterns that Victoria's evasion techniques hadn't been designed to counter. For the first time in 4 years, she found herself in a situation where discovery and engagement were probable rather than possible, and where her survival would depend on combat capabilities rather than concealment and evasion. Victoria's response to the coordinated enemy search was to conduct preemptive strikes against search teams before they could locate her position, while simultaneously requesting immediate close air support from coalition forces that could assist in breaking enemy contact and creating opportunities for displacement to areas where concealment was possible. But the enemy's search operation had been planned to account for Victoria's likely responses, and her preemptive strikes triggered coordinated attacks by enemy forces who had positioned themselves to respond immediately when she revealed her location through combat activities. The engagement that followed was Victoria's first sustained air-to-ground combat in 4 years, requiring her to employ tactics and techniques that she had developed through extended operations in an environment where conventional air support doctrine was inadequate for her operational requirements. Victoria's aircraft sustained damage during the engagement that compromised its flight capabilities while remaining flyable enough for emergency procedures that might allow her to reach coalition territory if she could break enemy contact and navigate approximately 200 miles through hostile airspace where ISIS and Syrian government forces would attempt to intercept her. The decision to attempt return to coalition territory was prompted by Victoria's assessment that her position had been compromised beyond recovery, and that continued independent operations would be impossible given the level of enemy attention that her location was now receiving. Victoria's emergency departure from her operating area was conducted under fire from enemy forces who had surrounded her position and were attempting to prevent her escape through concentrated surface-to-air fire that threatened to finish what ISIS missiles had started 4 years earlier. Her aircraft cleared the immediate threat area with damage that required constant attention to flight controls, but the emergency departure had consumed fuel that would be necessary for reaching coalition territory, creating a new survival scenario that required immediate assistance from coalition forces if she was going to avoid forced landing in territory that was certainly hostile. Victoria's call for emergency assistance was the first time in 4 years that she had requested immediate support for her personal survival rather than mission objectives. Any coalition aircraft, this is Phoenix actual declaring emergency. I am departing ALR under enemy fire with battle damage and low fuel. Request immediate assistance for emergency recovery procedures. The call was answered by Eagle Flight, a 4-aircraft formation of F-16 fighters that were conducting routine patrol operations approximately 150 miles from Victoria's location. The flight leader, Major Jake Collins, acknowledged Victoria's emergency call and requested her position and condition for a coordination of assistance procedures. But when Major Collins received Victoria's aircraft identification number, his response reflected disbelief that would be shared by every coalition pilot who learned that Captain Victoria Phoenix Steele was not only alive, but had been conducting combat operations behind enemy lines for the past 4 years. Phoenix Actual, confirm your aircraft tail number. Did you say 810967? Victoria's response was matter of fact. Affirmative, Eagle Flight. Aircraft 810967. Captain Victoria Steele, requesting immediate assistance for emergency recovery. The silence that followed lasted exactly 7 seconds before Major Collins responded. Phoenix Actual, stand by for assistance. We're coming to get you. The recovery operation that followed was designated Operation Homecoming and involved every available coalition aircraft in the region, along with search and rescue teams, medical personnel, and intelligence specialists who were prepared to debrief the pilot whose 4-year independent deployment had achieved strategic effects that exceeded what most conventional military units accomplished during entire deployment cycles. Major Collins and Eagle Flight provided close air support during Victoria's emergency transit to coalition territory, engaging enemy forces that attempted to intercept her damaged aircraft while coordinating with tanker aircraft that provided aerial refueling to extend her range until she could reach emergency landing facilities. The aerial refueling operation was complicated by damage to Victoria's aircraft that made standard refueling procedures dangerous, requiring improvised techniques that tested the skills of both Victoria and the tanker crew who were attempting to provide fuel to an aircraft whose flight characteristics had been compromised by battle damage. Victoria's approach to Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq was conducted with equipment failures that made normal landing procedures impossible, requiring emergency techniques that drew upon every aspect of her training and experience to set the aircraft down safely despite significant damage to flight control systems and landing gear. The landing was successful, but barely. Victoria's A-10 came to rest on a runway with damage that made the aircraft unrepairable, marking the end of 4 years of independent operations that had been sustained through improvised maintenance and determination that it kept her aircraft flyable far beyond what design specifications had anticipated. Victoria's emergence from her aircraft was witnessed by personnel who understood that they were observing the end of one of the most extraordinary individual deployments in modern military history. Her appearance reflected 4 years of independent operations behind enemy lines, equipment that had been improvised and repaired repeatedly, clothing that had been patched and replaced with materials obtained through field expedient methods, and the bearing of someone who had adapted to operational conditions that exceeded what most military personnel ever experienced. But Victoria's first words after landing reflected her continued focus on mission objectives rather than personal considerations. "I need to debrief intelligence personnel on enemy leadership locations and capabilities. The information is time-sensitive and could affect ongoing operations." Victoria's debriefing lasted 6 days and produced intelligence assessments that filled hundreds of pages with information about ICE's operations, leadership structures, logistics capabilities, and strategic plans that had been observed through 4 years of direct surveillance behind enemy lines. The information was more detailed and accurate than what coalition intelligence had been able to develop through conventional collection methods, and provided targeting data that would be used for operations that eliminated remaining ISIS leadership throughout the region. But Victoria's debriefing also revealed the personal cost of her 4-year independent deployment. Her adaptation to extended isolation, constant threat, and complete self-reliance had produced psychological changes that made reintegration with conventional military operations challenging in ways that exceeded what military psychologists had previously encountered. Victoria's request for continued independent operations was denied by medical personnel, who determined that her 4-year deployment had exceeded safe limits for extended isolation, and that her return conventional operations required rehabilitation and reintegration procedures that would prepare her for resuming normal military duties. The rehabilitation process lasted 8 months and included medical treatment for injuries sustained during 4 years of operations in conditions where proper medical care wasn't available, psychological counseling that addressed adaptation issues created by extended isolation, and training that would allow her to resume operations using current equipment and procedures that had evolved during her absence from conventional military units. Victoria's return to active duty was conducted with assignment to positions that utilized her experience from independent operations while allowing gradual reintegration with conventional military procedures and social environments that she had been isolated from for over 4 years. Her new assignments included training programs that taught other pilots techniques that Victoria had developed for independent operations, intelligence analysis that incorporated lessons learned from her 4-year deployment, and operational planning that applied her understanding of combat operations in environments where conventional support was unavailable. 5 years after her return from independent operations, Colonel Victoria Phoenix Steele had become one of the Air Force's most respected authorities on combat operations in hostile environments, having translated her 4-year behind-the-lines experience into training programs that prepared other pilots for missions that might require extended independent operations. Her promotion to colonel reflected not just her extraordinary service during 4 years of independent combat operations, but her contributions to military effectiveness through training and development programs that enhance the capabilities of pilots who might face similar challenges in future conflicts. Victoria's experience had been incorporated into survival training curricula, combat operations doctrine, and equipment development programs that were designed to support pilots who might find themselves operating independently behind enemy lines for extended periods. Her techniques for aircraft maintenance, resource management, and psychological adaptation had become standard instruction for pilots whose missions might require capabilities that exceeded conventional training. But Victoria's most significant contribution was her demonstration that individual initiative and determination could achieve strategic effects in situations where conventional military operations were inadequate or unavailable. Her 4-year independent deployment had proven that properly trained and equipped individuals could accomplish objectives that had previously been considered impossible without large-scale military operations. Victoria's story became required study in military leadership courses, not just for what it revealed about survival and combat operations, but for what it demonstrated about the importance of individual responsibility and initiative in situations where standard procedures and support systems were unavailable. Her experience was also studied by military psychologists who were interested in understanding how individuals could adapt to extreme isolation and stress while maintaining mission effectiveness over extended periods. Victoria's psychological adaptation to 4 years of independent operations provided insights that informed training programs and support systems for personnel who might face similar challenges. But Victoria's legacy extended beyond military applications. Her story became an example of how individuals could overcome circumstances that seemed impossible, achieve objectives that exceeded what others considered possible, and maintain dedication to purposes larger than personal considerations, even when support systems failed and conventional options were unavailable. Victoria never discussed her 4 years behind enemy lines in public forums, understanding that operational security considerations require protecting methods and capabilities that might be needed for future operations. But within military communities, her story became legendary as an example of what could be accomplished when training, determination, and mission focus combined to overcome challenges that exceeded what most people could imagine surviving. The memorial that had been erected at Nellis Air Force Base to honor Victoria's presumed death was replaced with recognition of her extraordinary service during 4 years of independent combat operations. But Victoria herself preferred recognition that focused on mission accomplishment rather than individual heroism, understanding that her effectiveness had depended on training and support systems that represented collective military capabilities rather than individual achievement. Victoria's aircraft, tail number 810967, was retired and placed on display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force, where it serves as recognition of both technological capabilities and human determination that combined to achieve results that exceeded what designers and planners had considered possible when the aircraft was originally built. But Victoria continued flying, now in assignments that allowed her to share her experience with pilots who might face similar challenges in future conflicts. Her training programs prepared others for independent operations, while her operational planning contributed to mission effectiveness in environments where conventional approaches were inadequate. Her call sign Phoenix had proven prophetic, representing not just survival and resurrection, but transformation and adaptation that had created capabilities that exceeded what had existed before a 4-year independent deployment behind enemy lines. In military communities where her story was known, Victoria Steele was remembered not just as an exceptional pilot who had survived impossible circumstances, but as an example of how individual excellence and institutional support could combine to achieve objectives that serve purposes larger than any individual mission or deployment. Some heroes are celebrated for single acts of courage that define moments of crisis. Others are remembered for sustained excellence that demonstrates what becomes possible when training, determination, and mission focus are maintained over extended periods despite challenges that would defeat most people. Victoria Phoenix Steele belonged to the second category, a reminder that the most important victories are often achieved through persistent effort rather than dramatic action, and that true heroism is measured not by the circumstances that test us, but by our response to those circumstances when everything depends on individual determination to continue the mission regardless of personal cost. The F-16 pilots who had frozen at the tail number had witnessed more than the return of a pilot who was supposed to be dead. They had witnessed proof that some warriors never stopped fighting, never stopped serving, and never abandoned their mission, even when the world has forgotten they exist. Victoria's story reminded everyone who heard it that legends don't die in crashed aircraft or emergency landings. They adapt, survive, and keep flying until their work is finished.